In September 1970, Jimi Hendrix arrived in London, his adopted home in the city where his rise to stardom began 4 years earlier. He was there to promote a new phase of his career, one in which he would leave behind the band that had made him a household name, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and step out as a solo artist with greater creative control. He moved into a modest, stucco-fronted building in the posh Notting Hill neighborhood with a woman he was seeing named Monika Denneman, a former figure skater from Germany. Hendrix spent his last days in London meeting with musicians and friends, trying to assemble new bandmates and book a US tour. At night, he recorded rough demos and jammed with friends, often experimenting with new sounds and ideas, as well as all manner of hallucinogens. Hendrix was the most electrifying guitarist in the world, a musician whose innovations had permanently altered the sound of rock and roll. His 1967 debut album, Are You Experienced?, announced his arrival as a genre-shattering force, blending psychedelic rock, blues, and funk into a raw and explosive style that had never been heard before. Songs like Purple Haze, Hey Joe, and The Wind Cries Mary made Hendrix a legend, and his headlining performance at Woodstock in August of 1969, and in particular his rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner, which became the festival's defining moment, cemented him as a symbol of both countercultural rebellion and unmatched musical genius. But as Hendrix fame exploded, so did the pressures and chaos that came with it. He was overworked, underpaid, and frequently manipulated by his management. The constant touring and lack of stability left him exhausted and increasingly relying on sleeping pills, amphetamines, alcohol, and LSD to keep him going. He told friends that he felt trapped by fame, by his management, and even by his own public persona. He wanted to create more complex, jazz-influenced music and escape the constant demands after Woodstock to play for large festival crowds, which required far more of him and paid far less than more intimate gigs. By the summer of 1970, Hendrix was struggling, both personally and professionally. The Band of Gypsies, a short-lived experimental trio, had dissolved amid backstage conflict, and his new band, Cry of Love, was unknown. He was reportedly broke, despite being one of the highest-grossing acts in the world, and though he spoke about wanting to get clean and find a new direction, he remained mired in the same pattern of late nights, erratic behavior, and substance abuse. On the evening of September 17th, Hendrix joined Denneman at her flat after a long day of meetings and interviews. He was reportedly in a mellow mood, but tired. He took a few sleeping pills, Vesperax, a powerful German sedative, and washed them down with red wine. When he didn't feel their effects, he took more drugs and drank more wine. Sometime in the early morning hours of September 18th, Jimi Hendrix slipped into unconsciousness and began to asphyxiate. Denneman called paramedics, who found Hendrix unresponsive, a toxic mix of drugs and wine spilling from his mouth and his airways filled with vomit. He was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital just after noon. Jimi Hendrix was 27 years old. I'm Jason Beckerman.
I'm Derek Kaufman.
This is Last Days, Jimi Hendrix.
Jimi Hendrix's death fits a sadly familiar pattern, an extraordinarily gifted young artist whose life is cut short by drugs and alcohol at the height of his fame. He was the second to join what would later come to be known as the 27 Club, following the death of Rolling Stones founder Brian Jones just a year earlier. Since then, others, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse, have tragically followed, each dying at the same age, 27 years old. But to view Hendrix merely as a cautionary tale of wealth and excess is to miss the profound impact he had on music and culture. In the brief span of just 4 years, from the formation of the Jimi Hendrix Experience in 1966 to his death in September 1970, Hendrix reshaped the sound and scope of rock music. He redefined what the electric guitar could do and brought out sounds no one knew it had. To this day, he is universally considered the greatest guitarist there ever was. Rolling Stone magazine, in ranking him first among 250 guitar legends, said he, more than any artist before or since, quote, exploded our idea of what rock music could be. He was, quote, a showman who played with his teeth or behind his back, but underneath all the theatrics is the true master of the instrument. His career may have lasted a short time, but musicians spend a lifetime studying his dazzling technique and improvisational genius. Hendrix's 1967 debut album, Are You Experienced?, marked a seismic shift. Tracks like Purple Haze and Foxy Lady were enormous hits, showcasing Hendrix's technique and his wild use of distortion and feedback. When the album was released in May 1967 during an era already bursting with musical innovation, Jimi Hendrix's debut stood apart, a genre-bending force that fused multiple musical styles into something entirely new. The album introduced Hendrix as both a guitar virtuoso and a revolutionary who expanded the possibilities of music. The album reached number 2 on Billboard, held off only by Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles, and stayed on the charts for over 2 years. Rolling Stone would later call it, quote, the most exciting debut album in the history of rock. The song Purple Haze in particular became an instant anthem. The song introduced mainstream audiences to Hendrix's singular guitar style and became a staple of FM radio and its signature sound, beginning with perhaps the most famous guitar riff in music history. It was, for a generation of kids, a calling card for the counterculture.
He's obviously most known, Derek, as an otherworldly guitar player.
What do you say about Jimi Hendrix? He's the god. He's the guitar rock god of all history.
Gretzky, right? Or the Michael Jordan to what they did, like the unchallenged number one. Nobody really sort of intelligently disputes the fact he's the greatest of all time. He invented sounds that nobody had seen or heard before.
He's one of those figures, if someone says, you know what, he's overrated, or there's another guitar player, they sound like they're trolling. They're trolling. Exactly. You know, the Jimi Hendrix is Jimi Hendrix. And when I was a kid, he's before either of us.
Yes.
So we only know Jimi Hendrix as a rock god, right? And he was passed down to us. But my mom went to Woodstock and saw him play with his teeth and things like that. And so he is a person who occupies a mythic status more than anyone, and up there with anyone we've ever covered.
Yeah, but I think what is lost about him, and I was a fan, I went through a Hendrix phase, sort of, early college for me. He's an underrated lyricist, really underrated. He's known as this great guitarist, and that's sort of how he'll always be identified. But his lyrics are really spectacular. If you go back and listen to Purple Haze or I think my favorite Hendrix song, The Wind Cries Mary, which is a much quieter, more emotional work than his more well-known tracks, it is simply sublime. The lyrics are fantastic. Legend has it that he wrote the song after a fight with his girlfriend as an expression of sadness and regret.
Will the wind ever remember the names it has blown in the past? With the scratch its old age and its wisdom, which was no, this will be the last.
Derek, those lyrics ask whether the pain and people who've lost it are remembered or they carried away and forgotten by time. It's sort of one of those things like, is the pain that I suffered from you worth it to make me a better person, or do I wish I wouldn't have suffered it at all? It's just a brilliant song.
There's a reason it's an all-time. It's poetry, right? And poetry is timeless, and you can listen to The Wind Cries Mary at any point in your life, and it will have resonance and meaning.
The album, Are You Experienced, just transformed Jimi's life. Practically overnight, he became an international sensation and a symbol of a new musical future. Quote, "It was like he came from another planet," said Eric Clapton, who famously watched Hendrix perform Hey Joe in a London club and knew instantly that the guitar game had changed. Paul McCartney, an early and vocal champion, said that Hendrix's arrival was, quote, "one of the most exciting times in my life." The critical acclaim wasn't just hype. Are You Experienced elevated Hendrix into mainstream consciousness, making him one of the first black rock stars to be embraced by a predominantly white audience in both the US and Europe. At a time when American radio stations were still segregated, Hendrix's music crossed lines by disrupting expectations and reconfiguring what rock could be. He went from being an unknown sideman to fronting the experience at the Monterey Pop Festival just weeks after the album's US release, a performance that ended with Hendrix setting his guitar on fire and cementing his legend. Jimi Hendrix was acutely aware of his racial identity and the significance of being a black man rising to fame in a genre dominated by white artists and audiences. Those close to him knew he was conscious of the burdens and expectations placed on him as a cultural figure. His longtime friend and bandmate, Billy Cox, also a black man, said, quote, "Jimi was in a tricky position. He didn't want to be put in a box, but he knew he was representing something bigger." Hendrix had grown up listening to black blues legends like Muddy Waters and B.B. King, and he often cited them as key influences. But by the time Are You Experienced made him a star, his music was being marketed almost exclusively to white countercultural fans. His sound and appearance challenged both racial and musical norms, and though he played loud, psychedelic rock, many black fans and critics at the time didn't know what to make of him. Cox said, quote, "Some black folks thought he was playing white music. but he was always drawing from our roots.
Rather than lean fully into his role as a racial trailblazer or reject it outright, Hendrix tried to walk a complex and uneasy line. He resisted attempts to politicize him, declining invitations to align himself with civil rights leaders or black power groups. "I'm not a politician," Hendrix once said, "but I feel that if I do something good with my music, that's my contribution." In 1969, Jet magazine, a major voice in black media, published a critical article titled, quote, "Is Jimi Hendrix a black man's rock and roller or a white man's puppet?" The piece highlighted concerns that Hendrix had turned his back on black audiences by surrounding himself with white people and rarely performing at predominantly black venues. Hendrix was stung by these criticisms. He reportedly told a friend, "I can't be anything but myself. I'm trying to do something different and people either get it or they don't." But while controversy swirled around him, Hendrix kept pumping out great music in 1968 and 1969, pushing boundaries even as his public image was increasingly consumed by tales of drug use, erratic behavior, and mounting tensions within the experience. The chaos around him only seemed to fuel his artistic ambition, culminating in the release of Electric Ladyland in October 1968, his only self-produced album and arguably his most adventurous. Sprawling and dense, it was Hendrix's studio masterpiece, a double LP that blurred the lines between rock, blues, funk, and psychedelia, and confirmed his status not just as a guitar god, but as an innovative composer and producer. The album's centerpiece, both commercially and artistically, was his electrifying reimagining of Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower. You know, Jason, this album is an all-timer.
Yeah.
Everyone knows Purple Haze, and that's sort of a starter kit for Jimi Hendrix. But when you hear what he did with a Bob Dylan classic, I mean, Bob Dylan was already sort of celebrated as the poet laureate of the generation.
Huge star. It's actually his
Massive.
greatest days were a couple years behind him, but he was still an enormous star.
Hugely respected, so covering one of his songs was a big undertaking. That's his song. This is like Sinead O'Connor taking that song from Prince. It is her song just as much as All Along the Watchtower. I defy you to tell me that Bob Dylan's version is as good as Jimi Hendrix.
Well,
it's just not.
It's not just us that think so. Bob Dylan himself acknowledged that Hendrix's song. Bob Dylan was not one to give praise to others. He actually said that the song, Hendrix's version, overwhelmed me, really. He had such talent. He could find things inside a song and vigorously develop them. And he actually started later in his career playing only the Hendrix version. He abandoned his own version. Let's listen to both of them, actually. Here's Dylan's original 1967 version.
There must be some way out of here, said the joker to the thief. There's too much confusion, I can't get no relief.
Now compare that to Hendrix's from the following year.
There must be some kind of way out of here, say the joker to the thief. There's too much confusion, I can't get no
It's just a difference in kind, right? Hendrix has taken this spare biblical folk tune and transformed it into this like urgent cry for revolution. Like we said, Dylan himself came out and said his version is just better than mine, and he adopted that as his own.
Yeah.
I mean, credit to Dylan for writing the song, perhaps the greatest songwriter ever.
But it's a Hendrix song.
But it's a Hendrix song now, and it's truly a masterpiece.
And you're right. You know, Dylan was the type of person. He was crusty. He was a sort of cantankerous kind of figure throughout his career. So giving a song up and praising it, no less, because he was a quiet sort of from the Beat generation.
Very highly of himself, Bob Dylan did. He thought he
a
was
big
like
ego,
the greatest thing ever, and here this other guy comes along and takes it and turns it into something else. He's like, that's just better.
Yeah, and you could see a guy like Dylan saying, "Oh, you overdid it. That's not the spirit of the song. It's supposed to be a poem." The Hendrix version is big, but it's still steeped in meaning, and even Bob Dylan knew that.
All Along the Watchtower became Hendrix's highest charting U.S. single, and eventually the definitive version, as we said earlier, Dylan himself adopted and used throughout his career. But then later it happened. The energy that had once seemed limitless began to fade. Hendrix, once a tireless performer and restless creator, started to slow down. He was sleeping less, forgetting appointments, showing up late to rehearsals, or not going at all. His growing reliance on drugs — he took LSD to escape, amphetamines to stay awake, downers to fall asleep, and alcohol to take the edge off — became harder to hide. Those close to him noticed mood swings, long silences, sudden bursts of anger. His behavior became more erratic, his focus harder to sustain.
Still, the demands never let up. His schedule remained punishing, a string of festival appearances, recording sessions, and legal obligations, all while his physical and mental health deteriorated. He was arrested in Canada on drug charges. He was dealing with lawsuits, label pressure, and disputes with his management. In concert, he vacillated between transcendent and lethargic, at times turning his back on the audience, mumbling through lyrics, or leaving the stage mid-song.
I tried, Derek, to find a clip. There's plenty of clips out there of him doing that rambling thing on stage. None of them are usable in an audio sort of context like this because you can't hear what he's doing. But if you go and find him out there, it's sort of sad to watch him. He's clearly, as we now know, completely wasted. And he's just kind of mumbling on stage. And he's playing these huge festivals where everybody's kind of wasted. And they don't really start booing him or anything like that. It's not like that Amy Winehouse situation we once played where people start to boo. Nobody was booing. They're cheering along, but he's not making any sense on stage.
And it's striking.
Completely lost.
We talk about this all the time with the 27 Club in particular. These are very young people who just seem very old and washed out.
Yes.
Such an early point in life. They're in their mid-20s and they're mumbling around and stumbling on stage. It's a very sad scene. And his close friends said he looked gaunt and tired. He told reporters cryptically, "I've been dead a long time." In January of 1970, Hendrix met Monika Dannemann, the German figure skater in Dusseldorf. She was a devoted admirer and had waited outside his hotel to meet him after a show. The two spent the night talking, and though Hendrix returned to London shortly after, they remained in touch. Their relationship was intermittent over the following months, complicated by Hendrix's other romantic entanglements and his increasingly unstable lifestyle. Throughout the year, regardless of where he was or who he was with, his abuse of drugs and alcohol continued to escalate, with sleeping pills to come down after shows and stimulants to get back up again, leaving him in a constant state of imbalance. On September 15th, with both he and Dannemann back in London, the two moved into Dannemann's Notting Hill flat, where he consumed that toxic mix of drugs and alcohol that 3 days later would end his life. Next to his body, the medical examiner found a note on which Hendrix had scribbled apparently just minutes before he died. Quote, "Story of life is quicker than the wink of an eye. Story of love is hello and goodbye until we meet again."
I want to talk. We sometimes do counterfactuals. What would have happened had Jimi Hendrix not died? It's one of the most tantalizing what ifs, I think, in movie history. In the months before his death, he was already pulling away from the psychedelic rock that had made him famous, began sketching these ideas for jazz, rock, fusion group, talking with Miles Davis about a possible collaboration, and even writing orchestral compositions with kind of an avant-garde ambitiousness. He just... I think it's tantalizing to think about what it would have been like. Here's obviously a guitar virtuoso, but also a brilliant lyricist, and he wanted to mellow out. He wanted to do more jazz, but also bring sort of his rock sensibilities to it.
I also think, and you pointed on to this in the beginning of the episode, that the racial dimensions of Jimi Hendrix are very prominent because he was a black artist, but he was in that rock scene, which was largely white.
At the time, it was almost exclusively.
Almost
black.
exclusively.
To the extent it's more segregated now, not really. He was a lone person.
And he was so good. He was at Woodstock, but there weren't many black faces at Woodstock and things like that. This was a very white form of music, and he was taken to task by some critics. That article was devastating to him at the time. And I think his move towards jazz and rock fusion is a step in the direction. Wanting to work with Miles Davis is a gesture towards wanting to strike a different balance going forward. We'll never know, but I could have seen him, sort of tack into that direction a bit more with jazz influences and honoring some of the blues legends of the time so that he could be set apart in some ways from that psychedelic rock scene, which was so white, and then just Jimi Hendrix as well.
So he's just founding his own studio. He's going to call it Electric Lady Studios, which he designed as a refuge from commercial pressure. He really wanted to be, he had gotten burned by all artists at that time, young artists got burned by their studios, their management, and he was one of them. He lost a ton of money. And honestly, what he wanted to do was create sort of this legendary hub for boundary-pushing artists, pull away from the constant touring. At the time, you didn't make as much money touring as you do selling albums. You wanted to sell lots of albums and make his money that way, get away from that festival landscape that had made it famous, but also took a huge toll on him. Obviously, the entire drug culture. He really wanted to lean into producing and composing. He was very vocal about what he wanted to do in the next stage of his life. And sort of one chapter was kind of coming to a close and a really exciting new one was coming, and he just never got the opportunity.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think he was trending a little bit more political as the calendar was turning? This was now the early 70s. He died in 1970. We're still in some of that post-civil rights movement.
Well, we're at the heart,
we're at the heart of it.
Vietnam right now, too, and there's obviously a transformative time. I think he was trending in that direction.
I do too.
Getting more political, and he was taken obviously a little too soon. Usually in this case, we wonder if he just could. We say, well, that's all fine and good, but he was too trapped in addiction, and maybe that's the case with him too. But as he's pulling back from the festival scene, I guess there's some hope that he would have kind of overcome his demons as well.
Yeah, people surfaced from it. From that era, Eric Clapton was heavily into heroin. He surfaced from it, and he's been a musician now for the decades since. Somewhat controversial figure in many ways. Others just can't. Janis Joplin, it's hard to even envision her getting out of her addictions. Amy Winehouse, it's hard to imagine. But people could surface. Chris Farley is another one I always think of. Like, what does it even mean to say Chris Farley isn't on drugs?
Yeah.
It was such a big part of his persona, that how reckless he was. Jimi Hendrix doesn't fit that way for me. It seems like he was a product of the 60s and of all that psychedelic stuff and LSD and so forth, but I thought he could have matured if he would have sort of turned the calendar.
Yeah. Years after Jimi Hendrix's death, Eric Clapton, when asked about being measured against the legend of Hendrix, dismissed any comparison between them outright, saying, quote, "He was simply the best guitar player that ever lived, and not just because of what he played, but how he played it. The sound, the emotion, the abandon. It was like he came from another planet." He later remarked, quote, "When I first saw him, I thought, my God, this is it. This is the end of the game. I thought I was going to leave the music business because I'd seen the real thing."